Goodo. Hey, I'm happy to see everybody. And this is the second to last meeting we will have for a while. So today I'm going to read about 5 stories. I quickly do it because we have to get off at maybe say quarter of. I'm going to be reading about Clarence Heckendorn, George Miller, The Hoax of 1938, and about geology in the Methow and the studies of Mr. Barksdale. What's his first name? Anyway, and then the last one is going to be Matt Olison.
Oh.
All right, I'm going to start now with Clarence Heckendorn. Clarence Heckendorn, okay, this was written, I wrote this for the Methow Valley News in August 20th, 1981. Clarence Heckendorn, 87, can recall the sound of Guy Waring's voice, Waring being the founder of Winthrop. And he can also say that there were a lot of people who didn't particularly like Waring and his Boston accent. So Clarence's father tried to sway affiliations toward the 40 acres adjacent to Winthrop to make it the main center of commerce. But Winthrop was more established. Now, this is about 1903, and to this day, Heckendorn remains Winthrop's suburb. Clarence has a few artifacts that shine a light on the Methow Valley's far and murky past. For instance, a scroll of imperial trading cloth upon which is neatly and indelibly penned a 1917 map for the right-of-way committee of the route of the Methow Valley Railroad from Twisp to Winthrop. Another he unfolded carefully. It was a February 14th, 1896 issue of the Chelan Leader, whose motto was independent in all things, neutral in nothing, whose front page has an article describing the Methow Valley like this. Okay, so remember, this is 1896. This valley is just booming ahead, it begins, and goes on to describe the many kinds of vegetables and fruits raised here in profusion, that the neighborhood of Winthrop was experiencing a building boom. Quote, there have been several large barns put up, and that wheat was bringing in $1 a bushel, and that Mr. McCain had gone insane. Today, Clarence doesn't spend much time in downtown Winthrop because 70 years ago, we used to hang around the blacksmith shop. Now, there's no place to go. Back in 1899, when the Heckendorn family G'd and hawed their wagon over the Brewster Hill into this area, the town was just starting to take shape. In the next few years, a church was built, a store, a roller skating rink, several houses. My dad, David Eugene Heckendorn, had a finger in everything, Clarence recalls. Besides having platted a town, which he named after himself, he was a carpenter, ran a dairy herd, formed school district number 45, involved himself in the cemetery and ditch companies, and was a justice of the peace until his death in 1939. Clarence followed in his father's footsteps and tried everything. He's also quick on the draw when it comes to remembering faces and times past. In 1938, when he was packing for sheep owners Wallace and McCall, he made the acquaintance of an unbroke pack horse in his corral that a man had left me to bring back up into the hills. Clarence strapped on his trusty spurs, adjusted the saddlebags, and leaping onto the steed, he tickled her ribs, and few people in Heckendorn had ever seen a wilder ride as he bucked through town and out toward the mountains. That was a common sight in them days, he nods. Clarence remembers the pristine, trackless mountains surrounding the valley. Used to be, you just had to grab a blanket and a pack horse, go and kill a deer and eat it all up, he says. Logging roads ruined the country. Clarence moved to Cub Creek in 1926 to take a chance at ranching on his own. I sowed 100 pounds of alfalfa seed, and I don't think any of it came up, he claims. After the heavy snows of 1915, 1916 covered up the fence posts, more than a decade of drought pulled the rug out from under all the ranchers, living up every draw with a hog or two or three or cows. Through the 20s, the drought hung on, forcing many of those settlers to leave the valley, often a lot poorer than when they arrived. As for Clarence, after several years of trying to raise a dairy herd on dry stalks and dust, I lost everything I had, he said. 2 sons had been born, Henry and Bob, to Clarence and Mary during those Cub Creek years, and not long after the struggle with the ranch ended, Mary quit Clarence and went to live on the coast. After 35 years, she came back and they remarried. Mary died in 1979. It's a tribute to the valley that a man of Clarence's fiber stayed put here all his life. He never did hear the call to roam anywhere else. This satisfied me, he said. Now you know about Clarence Heckendorn. And here's a sort of a different story. George Miller, he was a real farmer. Poor old Clarence couldn't yank a stalk from the earth, but here's a different story. George Miller. George Miller first appeared to me early one morning as the campfire heated up the first pot of coffee. Before the sun had even thought of penetrating the Horse Heaven camp 10 miles up the Methow Trail, he appeared in story form, bursting with vigor out of the tales told by his Packer grandson, Ty Miller. Ty calls his grandfather Brown, or Farmer Brown, not just because he was once named Farmer of the Year in Okanogan County, but because it was common knowledge that the man could grow excess alfalfa where others had barely yanked out a stalk. Those pre-dawn anecdotes told by his 17-year-old horse-wise grandson created a heroic image of a man who hadn't been beaten by constant work or wild horses, who could play poker all night and farm all day, or trail 20 wild horses through the mountains from Oroville to the coast with only one other man along. As the sun rose on the camp, Ty packed the mules for the ride out of the wilderness, and George Miller appeared again in the deft movements of his grandson. When I first met George face to face, it was his eyes that got me. His look made me feel it was coming from a great distance, with nothing frivolous or bitter, as though it had been honed by a million hours of work in the sun and dust in every season. The look also recalled months worth of time in the saddle, trailing beasts into the wilderness, or pitting himself against them in the ring, or reining them to plow his fields. George was the oldest of 4 boys and a girl growing up on what is now named the Rose Miller Place up the rendezvous named after his mother. It was a piece of land his father had staked a claim to after he'd hiked over the mountains from Sedro-Woolley in 1907. When George was 14, his father died, leaving George with the greatest share of responsibility for the family. It was around about this time he began building up a string of bucking horses. He teamed up with Foss Creveling, and together they organized some of the biggest rodeos in the country, in the county, in Twisp. People came from far and near to see the horses and riders that they knew. One time in Okanagan, George and Foss brought some of George's bucking horses over to the rodeo, and the two of them ended up being the only riders for the day. They were the whole show for $2 a head. Foss rode 13 of them, and George rode 9 or 10. And that was back when a dollar looked a lot bigger than it does now, he commented. His favorite pack animal was a mule named Pasayten Pete. No one could ever ride him, he contended. He bucked like anything and could jump any fence or gate. He once told Charlie Flagg, "Look, if anyone wants to buy the pack string, sell it, but bring old Pete home, even if you have to ride him." Sentimentality was never one of George's weaknesses, except when it came to that mule. In 1942, he moved to the Bonning place on Bawkey Hill. By this time, he had a family, his wife, Mary Damon, and 4 boys, Wayne, who was also known as Swede, Ross, Carl, who just died recently, and Claude. Along with the farm came a slew of wild horses, which had roamed the fenceless hills for years. George rounded them up and made them either part of his rodeo string, his pack string, or his work teams. I can't really say which of his accomplishments or traits most people remember George for, but Farmer Brown was certainly known as the man who could make hay better than anyone else. Even though I found a good man to run the pack string, and that was Charlie Flagg, I probably couldn't have found a good man to run the farm, he said. Through experimentation, he found out how to seed alfalfa so that almost every seed sprouted. Most people plant it too deep, he explained. Mary died in 1971, and George's farming days were just about over. He married Clara Northcott Girard in 1974, and they moved to Manson. Even though Clara once overheard George calling the Chelan country sour apples, George admitted that the Methow Valley now tends to leave a bad taste in his mouth. What he hates to see are the old ranches so run down, the land going back to weed. I can just imagine George looking out the car window as they drive up the valley on their frequent visits, looking hard at the acres of Barnaby thistle, which he remembers as alfalfa or grain. I imagine his eyes seeing the land gone to seed, seeing it all from a great distance, and him not saying a word. This story is about the hoax of 1938 that galvanized everybody in the country and local miners. I wrote it for the Methow Valley News in October 29th, 1981. The Martians have landed. The Martians have landed. On Halloween, more than 4 decades ago, radio listeners across the USA heard a frantic announcer in New York City yell those words and begin to sputter a blow-by-blow description of an invasion of aliens taking place before his horrified eyes. It was frightening enough for those listening inside their own homes in neighborhoods across the nation to hear such news. But think of the few Methow Valley men deep in the wilderness of the Cascade Mountains working at the azurite mine who happened to be listening to the radio at that time. Many of them were struck by the precariousness of their situation, if beings from Mars were indeed taking over the world. Those who still remember that October evening in 1938 include Vic Boesel, Jay Stokes, Bob Madison, and Dick Nickel, who were working at the gold mine in various capacities that year. "It was kind of spooky," Vic Boesel understated recently. "That broadcast was so natural, you'd have swore it was real." Vic was camp cook at the time. "There we were, miles from nowhere, when it came out of the blue," he said. "Miners not working the shift were often in the recreation room with its good-sized radio, which was usually on. The men were sitting around talking or playing cards when the commentator, who was actor and producer Orson Welles, and his henchmen, started describing what they were seeing. You know, they were all excited, and that made it worse," said Vic, whose memory of that program has dimmed little in the last 40 years. Bob Madison recalled the scene vividly. He said that the miners on that remote mountainside began picturing little green men spreading throughout the world, and they started calculating how fast they could pack, strap on their snowshoes, and get out of those snowy hills and back to their families. Jay Stokes, who had the coldest job at the mine, he says, as motorman, happened to be playing pinochle with a bunch of the guys when someone came up to them and said, "We're being invaded by people from Mars." "That was a tense moment," Jay conceded. "They threw down their cards and rushed to the radio." "It was very realistic," said Jay, "and it went on and on and on." I asked Jay if he had been worried. "Oh, I was young then," he said. "I felt I could weather anything that came up," including Martians landing on the Earth, apparently. At the end of the program, Orson Welles allowed us how the broadcast had been produced just for fun, a little Halloween prank for the country's entertainment. The Azurite miners looked at each other and went back to their cards. "When it came out, it had just been a hoax," said Jay. "We knew we had got our leg pulled, but good." All right. How we doing? Okay? Yes. Yeah, we're doing okay. So this is, I read for the Methow Valley News. I'm reading it from the paper itself. February 14th, 1985. Its headline is "Barksdale spent 40 years studying valley geology." About 15,000 years ago, ice a mile thick covered Winthrop's environs. Near Sun Mountain Lodge, several granite rocks sit on the ground, which didn't spawn them. They came down piggyback from Canada on the massive Ice Age flow. Twin Lakes are classic examples of what glacial geologists call kettles. They were formed by two gigantic blocks of glacial ice, which melted slower than the surrounding ice. These enticing facts were gleaned by Julian Barksdale, who spent more than 40 years unraveling the complex geology of 2,000 square miles of Okanagan County. Friends and colleagues of the geologist affectionately called the area Barksdalia. Barky, as Julian was known, died a little over a year ago. That was 1984, leaving behind a wealth of knowledge about the geology of the Methow Valley in papers written from 1941 until 1983. His last piece appeared in the spring 1983 issue of Okanagan County Heritage. Following in his footsteps, geology students flocked to the Methow, especially in the 1960s, to write their master's theses on any number of esoteric stories etched in the Methow Valley's rocks. The valley had a long geologic history of raising, folding, and faulting, Tucker Barksdale, his son, said recently. It's real complex. That was the challenge and the frustration for my father. Tucker, who lives in Winthrop, graduated with a degree in geology. And from the age of 7, he spent summers with his parents camped at early winters or the Pasayten Wilderness while his father tramped every hill and valley. The complexity of the geology here interested him the most. It was a puzzle he spent his life unraveling, said Tucker. Barkey's self-proclaimed love affair with the Methow began in 1938. At that time, the upper part of the valley was almost geologically unknown. According to Eric Cheney, who recently wrote a memorial to the geologist, at Hart's Pass, Barkey marveled at the beautifully displayed arkoses. I just looked up the word arkoses in my dictionary. It's not even there, so we'll just go on. In layman's terms, Barkey was sorely tempted to explore the geologically virgin region. After systematically mapping and categorizing all the rocks, he realized that the Canadian ice mass had penetrated the valley, pushing up the drainages and over Hart's Pass. Only peaks over 7,200 feet escaped the effects of the moving, grinding ice. And by the time the ice flow reached Carlton, where the valley is narrower, it was losing power and mass. Also at Hart's Pass, he discovered marine fossils of the chambered nautilus and squid families. Rock impressions of palm fronds and cones of the metasequoia plant appear in other areas of the valley. By reading the geologic language of these leavings, Barkey learned of the tremendous upheaval that beset the area a long time ago. He concluded that the mountainside, now over 6,000 feet, was once lying placidly under a warm, shallow sea, or it was the tropical shore of that sea. When he was not tramping the Methow Hills, Barkey devoted his talents to the University of Washington. His two worlds meshed well, the tactile world of researching the stories written in the rocks of the valley and the cerebral world of the university. By unmasking the secrets held in the valley's geology, he unearthed facts no one had ever guessed before. I sort of enjoy geology. Every year I pick up rocks and I wonder what they're all about. I take courses and it all goes out of my mind because it's too complex. I don't, I don't always get it. This last story is about Matt Olison, whom some of you know played music with us. Hey, Denny, don't go away. I have to show a picture. Oh, it went away. Anyway, here's a picture of Matt Olison. This is in the front page of the Wenatchee World. And he's wearing, look at that, his hat is that coyote. So Matt Olison played banjo in our band for about 10 years when he lived here. And this was written for the Wenatchee World, January 25th, 1987. This was after I had left the Methow Valley News in 1986. The headline in the story was, "Too many people, Methow Mountain Man moves out." Many people still consider the Methow Valley a place to get away from it all. But one man moved away 3 years ago because he felt it was moving in on him. Since the late 40s, the Methow had been Matt Oleson's hunting grounds. Since the late 60s, he'd lived in a remote corner of it. But by 1983, he found he needed more and fewer neighbors. One day, he rode off into the sunrise into Montana's Rockies. For Oleson has a soul of a mountain man, born 150 years too late. Today, he lives several unplowed miles from a bend in a side road called Trigo, happy as he's ever been, helping friend Phyllis Falconer raise Spanish Barb Mustangs. Only about 40 people in the country raise this type of horse, a registered breed descended directly from those who got away from the Spanish conquistadors. It became the horse of the mountain man and Indian. Horses tough enough for them, he laughed, are tough enough for me. At 77, Oleson is lean as a crowbar and walks as if his legs would prefer to straddle a horse. Despite the snowiness of his unruly beard and the opaque edges to his Icelandic blue eyes, he gives the impression of contained and sustained energy. In their gnarl and bend, his hands chronicle several lifetimes worth of exacting work with reins and plows and banjos, with sewing needles and axes. On the wall of his sleeping nook off the downstairs tack room, his black powder horn hangs from a hook beside hide pouches and hand-sewn buckskin garb. Dressed in those buckskins from animals which he killed, tanned, braided, beaded, and fringed with painstaking authenticity and detail, Oleson took grand champion in every 49ers parade in Winthrop for years. The costume also included handmade beaded moccasins patterned after Sioux or Blackfoot designs, headgear made from coyote pelt, and elaborate buckskin scabbards. Denny, this is a picture I think you missed. This is a picture of Matt. Since he moved away from the Methow, he has taken part in rendezvous, paraded in Eureka, Montana, and continued his tradition of running away with first place trophies. Until last year, that is. That year, Phyllis took first place, wearing an Indian costume which he had made. He took second. His striking presence in full regalia caught the eye of Western watercolor artist Charles Reed a couple of years ago, and for the past 2 years, Oleson has modeled for Reed's art seminars. Oleson's interest in the mountain man is far from just being cosmetic, however. His earliest boyhood reading introduced him to heroes he has revered all his life. As a young boy, he and his friends would take off into the woods for the day, shoot a rabbit and cook it up over a campfire, putting flesh, so to speak, on the stories they read. Oleson continues reading about and researching the lives and ways of apparel of the legendary beaver trappers of the early 1800s. Their way of life attracts Oleson. He's never been particularly at home with taking it easy. I never liked what comfort did to your resourcefulness, he explained. Oleson's life, especially his youth in North Dakota and Saskatchewan, and the 25 years since his retirement from the Navy, has been a testimony to his resourcefulness, always choosing to live close to the earth, close to nature, and on his own terms. Besides cutting enough firewood to keep them warm for several winters, last summer he and his wife put up 40 tons of hay. When you live on a ranch, you do what you got to do, he said. In this sort of life, you have to be jack of all trades and master of most of them. I must say," he went on, "I wouldn't want to live my life over again, but I don't feel envious of anybody." His practical, resourceful nature has always been complemented by lyricism. Besides painting and writing poetry, playing piano and banjo has added magic to his life. During the Depression, he'd drive a horse and sleigh 15 miles, play for a dance until 2 or 3 in the morning, and get home in time to do the chores with $2 extra in his pocket. For 10 years, he played banjo in various taverns and at various gatherings in Winthrop and Twisp. Today, the Olisons play music together in the wintertime when the workload lets up, and when the long meadow outside the window is under snow and the coyotes hunt near the mustangs. When meal times roll around, often as not, he'll ladle out generous helpings of chili made of elk and venison, or fry up a deer steak with spuds grown behind the corral under a mulch of hay. He's content. He's come home. He sits by the wood stove and studies a Charles M. Russell painting, or plans a ride into the mountains when the weather gets warmer, or wonders how many more years he'll be able to bring back wild meat to fill the larder. On a biting cold January morning recently, he climbed the loft of the barn as the mustangs jockeyed for position on the squeaky hard snow. Their white breath ballooned from their soft nostrils. Olison threw down the hay, then looked up at the clouds scudding across the horizon above the fringe of hills. "Look at those clouds," he pointed. "They look just like mountains." Even the sky tells Olison he's come home. Okay, why don't you unmute yourselves? I think that's enough for today since we have to stop a little early. And Patty, what did you paint today? Da, 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 da.
Wait, it's still wet.
It's still wet. Uh-oh.
Just a second, let me dab some of this.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody else? Oh, let's do that
Very
now. Holy moly, that's beautiful. Wow.
You did that whole thing just now?
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm not seeing it. You have to say something, Patty.
It's right here. Sheila.
Yeah,
Wow,
can't see it.
that is nice, Patty.
Thanks.
That is,
Sorry.
Patty,
It's
now,
scribbles.
just now I can see you. Would you lift it up again, please? I just thought you.
Just
And say
talk
something.
while you're holding it.
Pretty.
Thank you, thank you. Very nice.
talk, Patty, talk. Oh,
Oh, about?
we'll get to this Zoom shit.
I'd better take the recording off.